Hello there, and welcome. Before we begin our journey back in time to explore the lives of Victorian women, I want to take a moment to greet you wherever in the world you may be, whether it's morning, afternoon, evening, or the witching hour. I'm so glad you've chosen to join me for some quiet, sleepy history. In fact, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the globe. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy this type of soft, relaxing historical storytelling, I invite you to subscribe so you can drift off to more bedtime tales of the past. Now let's allow ourselves to sink deeper into relaxation as we set the scene. The year is 1837, and a young Queen Victoria has just ascended to the throne of England. The Victorian era has begun, ushering in a period of dramatic change, sweeping industrial progress, and strict societal order. Over the next 64 years of Victoria's reign, the British Empire will reach its height, spanning a quarter of the globe. Innovation and invention will transform daily life at a dizzying pace. And yet in this time of dizzying change, a woman's role remained rigidly defined and constrained. The life of a Victorian woman from queen to pauper was often one of hardship, repression, and shocking lack of agency. Over the next little while, as you rest and unwind, we'll explore the many complex facets of a Victorian woman's experience. We'll visit lavish manor houses and crowded city rooming houses, royal palaces and gloomy brothel. We'll witness the quiet tragedy of thwarted ambitions and staggering maternal loss rates. But we'll also meet some extraordinary women who managed to rebel against the suffocating constraints of their era and fight for something better. So, allow yourself to settle in, perhaps resting your eyes if you feel so called. Let the sounds of the modern world fade away as we travel back together to the gas-lit streets, foggy moors, and grand brick facades of Victorian England. And let us begin by stepping into the most central aspect of a Victorian woman's identity, the hallowed sphere of the home. To properly set the scene, we need to understand that a Victorian woman's world was strictly divided between public and private, and a lady's proper place was firmly in the domestic realm. As author and critic John Ruskin famously declared in 1865, men and women were designed for separate spheres based on their inherently different natures. In his lecture of Queen's Gardens, Ruskin celebrated the home as a woman's rightful domain. The woman's power is for rule, not for battle, and her intellect is not for invention or creation, but for sweet ordering, arrangement, and decision. She sees the qualities of things, their claims, and their places. Her great function is praise. She enters into no contest, but infallibly adjudges the crown of contest. By her office and place she is protected from all danger and temptation. The man in his rough work in open world must encounter all peril and trial, but he guards the woman from all this within his house, as ruled by her. This ideal of separate spheres was held up as the pinnacle of civilized society, and it defined a Victorian woman's entire existence. From the moment a girl child of the middle or upper classes was born, she was groomed for a life of domestic pursuits. She was educated not to expand her mind, but to mold her into the perfect angel in the house. The term coined by poet Coventry Patmore in praise of his meek, devoted, selfless wife, Emily. An angelic household paragon was expected to blissfully submit to her husband's authority while flawlessly overseeing every aspect of home life, managing cleaning, cooking, social engagements, the instruction of children, household accounts, and a full staff of servants, was no easy feat in an era without modern conveniences. A lady's work may have been centered around soft furnishings, fine china, and burbling tea kettles, but it was physically and mentally taxing labor all the same. Perhaps no one captured the sheer complexity of a Victorian housewife's duties better than Mrs. Isabella Beeton, whose senile 1861 domestic guide, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, became the indispensable Bible of the 19th century homemaker. Room by room and task by task, Mrs. Beeton scrupulously detailed the proper management of a Victorian home. From the slaughtering of livestock to the seasoning of soup to the weekly cleaning rota, hers was an exacting, exhausting standard of household perfection. And yet what few of Mrs. Beeton's devoted readers realized was that Isabella herself was often far too ill to personally live up to her own demanding ideals. Devoted, selfless wife, Emily, an angelic household paragon, was expected to blissfully submit to her husband's authority. Plagued by debilitating chronic disease after contracting syphilis from her philandering husband on their wedding night, Mrs. Beeton completed her domestic advice opus at the tender age of 23, only to die at 28, weakened by constant pregnancies and the unrelenting pressures of Victorian womanhood. The very avatar of selfless feminine domesticity had herself been ground down and destroyed by the impossible expectations placed upon her. Within the so-called sanctuary of the home, a Victorian woman had power, but she paid dearly for it. She worked her fingers to the bone to run her household while remaining ever smiling, ever charming, ever ready to soothe and please. The home may have been her refuge, but it was also her gilded cage. And yet for many well-to-do Victorian women, even this dubious domestic authority came at a steep price, one often paid on the marriage market. Continue developing the outline. As we've seen, life for women in Victorian England was marked by countless constraints and challenges, but there were some who dared to push back against society's rigid expectations in ways both big and small. One such woman was Florence Nightingale, whose journey to become a nurse was far from easy. Born into a life of wealth and privilege in 1820, the young Florence had little interest in the endless rounds of balls and social calls expected of a woman of her class. Instead, she found herself drawn to the idea of serving others through nursing, a most unladylike profession at the time. Her family was appalled when Florence announced her intentions. Nursing was seen as a lowly occupation suitable only for working-class women, not a respectable lady like their Florence. But Florence would not be swayed. She had found her calling and was determined to answer it no matter the cost. In 1844, over the strong objections of her mother and sister, Florence enrolled as a nursing student at the Lutheran Hospital of Pastor Fleiner in Germany. It was a bold, nearly unheard of move for a young woman of her background. After completing her training, Florence returned to London, ready to put her skills to use. But she faced resistance at every turn. The doctors and male administrators at the hospitals where she worked doubted her competence and resented taking orders from a woman. Some even refused outright to work with her. Still, Florence persevered. Her defining moment came during the Crimean War. With reports streaming in of appalling conditions and high mortality rates at the military hospital in Cottages, Florence assembled a team of nurses and set out for Turkey. What she found there was even worse than she had feared. Filthy, overcrowded wards crawling with rats, contaminated water, and rampant disease. Undaunted, Florence set to work. She procured fresh food and clean linens, established a laundry and kitchen, and instituted strict sanitary protocols. She made rounds at all hours, tending to patients and raising morale. Her tireless efforts paid off. In mere months, the hospital's mortality rate dropped from over 40% to just 2%. Florence's successes in Crimea made her a national hero. She became known as the Lady with a Lamp for her habit of making night rounds, and her name was spoken with reverence in households across England. Perhaps more importantly, she had single-handedly transformed the public image of nursing. No longer seen as a vocation of last resort, it was fast becoming a respected profession for dedicated women. Florence leveraged her newfound celebrity to continue advocating for healthcare reform. She established the Nightingale Home and Training School for Nurses in London, where she pioneered a rigorous curriculum emphasizing patient observation, hygiene, and care techniques that are still taught today. Her book Notes on Nursing, published in 1859, became a classic text. Though she spent the last several decades of her life as an invalid, Florence never stopped working. She wrote prolifically using statistics to lobby for public health measures like improved sanitation and nutrition. In 1907, she became the first woman to receive the Order of Merit, Britain's highest civilian honour. When Florence Nightingale died in 1910 at the age of 90, she had long since cemented her place in history. She had defied every convention and limitation placed on Victorian women to forge her own path and leave an indelible mark. Her courage and tenacity opened doors for the generations of women who would follow in her footsteps. Florence's story is a powerful reminder that even in the face of immense societal pressure, it's possible to make a difference. She refused to accept the domestic fate prescribed for women of her time. Of course, Florence's achievements, extraordinary as they were, did not erase the many hardships faced by women of her time. For every pioneering nurse or activist, there were countless others still toiling in obscurity, their dreams and ambitions thwarted. The vast majority, regardless of class, still had very little control over their own lives and destinies. It would take many more decades of tireless efforts by brave women like Florence Nightingale to shift the balance and secure the rights and freedoms we enjoy today. But each of their stories added crucial momentum to the slow, steady march of progress. Each defiant act, each boundary pushed, brought society that much closer to a world of true equality. So while the Victorian era was unquestionably brutal in many ways for women, it also planted the seeds of change. The first women's colleges were established. Laws around divorce and married women's property rights began to loosen. By the end of the 19th century, the first women's suffrage bills were being presented to Parliament. The notion that women might have a life outside of marriage and motherhood was no longer quite so unthinkable. None of this progress would have been possible without the courage and determination of women like Florence Nightingale. Women who were willing to endure ridicule, resistance, and worse, to stand up for their beliefs. Women who refused to be silenced or sidelined, who insisted on having a voice. As we've seen, that voice was often hard-won. For much of the Victorian era, the ideal woman was still expected to be demure, domestic, and submissive. She was to be a beautiful wife, a devoted mother, and a gracious hostess, never a boat rocker or rabble-rouser. To step outside that narrowly prescribed role was to court scandal and ostracism. But step outside they did. Through their words, their deeds, and their sheer force of will, the rebellious women of the Victorian era chipped away at the prevailing wisdom of what a woman could and should be. In so doing, they paved the way for the even more expansive victories to come in the 20th century and beyond. We still have a long way to go. Of course, true gender equality remains an elusive goal even today. But as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a moment of gratitude for those who came before, who dreamed that dream and fought that fight in the face of such daunting odds. The world we now inhabit would have been unimaginable to most Victorian women. The fact that it isn't is thanks to visionaries and trailblazers like Florence Nightingale, who refused to let their horizons be limited by the expectations of their time. May we all be emboldened by their example to continue reaching for a better, brighter, more equitable future, no matter the resistance we face. Because if the women of the Victorian era taught us anything, it's that change is possible, even against the steepest odds, that the status quo, no matter how entrenched, is not immutable, and that with enough grit and determination, a single voice can echo across generations, quietly at first, but with the power to reshape the world. The plight of Victorian women in the marriage market is perhaps best illustrated through the experiences and writings of Anne Theochery and Mary Ann Evans, who came of age in the early Victorian era. Both women were considered ugly ducklings, plain, bookish, and decidedly unfit for the ruthless marriage market that dominated society at the time. As the daughters of Gentile but not wealthy families, they were expected to marry and to marry well in order to secure their futures and those of their families. But without beauty, charm, or fortune, their prospects were bleak. Anne Theochery, the eldest daughter of famed novelist William Makepeace, was a shy, awkward girl who struggled to conform to the strict expectations of femininity. In her semi-autobiographical novel, The Story of Elizabeth, she sketches a painful portrait of a young woman navigating the perils of courtship and the marriage market. The novel's heroine, Elizabeth, is plain, poor, and socially inept, a clear stand-in for Anne herself. Through Elizabeth's eyes, we see the humiliating rituals of balls and social calls, the constant jockeying for position, the whispered gossip behind fans. We feel the acute pressure on women to perform femininity and secure a husband, no matter the cost to their dignity or well-being. Mary Ann Evans, who would later achieve fame as the novelist George Eliot, faced similar struggles as a young woman. Like Anne Theochery, she was intelligent and ambitious with little patience for the frivolities of courtship. She was also, by her own admission, magnificently ugly, deliciously hideous. In an era when a woman's worth was measured by her appearance and marriage ability, Mary Ann's prospects were grim. As she wryly observed in a letter to a friend, "I have the misfortune of being a woman and unmarriageable because of my plain face." For both Anne Theochery and Mary Ann Evans, the marriage market was a source of acute pain and frustration. They chafed against the limitations placed on women, the stifling expectations of femininity, the lack of alternatives to marriage. In their writings, they exposed the ugly underbelly of courtship and marriage in Victorian society, the transactional nature of it all, the cold calculations of status and fortune, the impossibility of true love or companionship. And yet, both women ultimately defied the constraints of their era to forge their own paths. Anne Theochery never married, but she found fulfillment as a writer, publishing several popular novels and supporting herself and her family through her literary efforts. Mary Ann Evans, too, bucked convention to pursue her intellectual ambitions. She moved to London, adopted a masculine pen name, and became one of the most celebrated novelists of her time. In their own ways, Anne Thackeray and Mary Ann Evans resisted the brutal expectations placed on Victorian women in the marriage market. Through their writings and their lives, they challenged the notion that a woman's worth lay solely in her ability to secure a husband. They offered a glimpse of a different path, one where women could be valued for their minds and their talents, not just their marriage ability. And while their individual rebellions were small and quiet in the face of such an entrenched system, they nonetheless helped to chip away at the edifice of patriarchy. One witty observation and one best-selling book at a time. Their stories serve as a reminder of just how few options were available to even privileged Victorian women when it came to securing their futures. Without beauty, wealth, or social connections, women like Anne Thackeray and Mary Ann Evans were at the mercy of a system that saw them as little more than commodities to be traded on the marriage market. And yet, through their determination and their gifts, they were able to imagine a different kind of life for themselves and for future generations of women. Sadly, even as some women were beginning to push back against the limits placed on them, Victorian society found new ways to constrain and control the female body and mind. One of the most insidious of these was the diagnosis of hysteria, a catch-all term for any kind of female malady or misbehavior. Under the banner of hysteria, Victorian women's physical and mental health complaints were routinely dismissed, belittled, or even used as justification for drastic medical interventions. The roots of hysteria as a female disorder can be traced back to ancient Greece, where it was believed that the womb could wander around the body, causing all manner of distress. This idea persisted into the Victorian era, with physicians continuing to view women's reproductive organs as the source of a host of ailments. Any outburst of emotion, any deviation from demure femininity, any physical complaint that could not be easily diagnosed was chalked up to hysteria, a disturbance of the wandering womb. For Victorian women, the consequences of a hysteria diagnosis could be severe. At best, they might be prescribed rest cures, confinement to bed for weeks or months on end. At worst, they could be subjected to dangerous and destructive treatments, from purging and bleeding to cauterization of the genitals. Many women were committed to asylums for hysteria, their freedom and autonomy stripped away in the name of controlling their unruly female bodies. The case of Nanny R.S. offers a chilling glimpse into the ways hysteria was weaponized against women in Victorian society. Nanny, a lively young woman from a wealthy southern family, began to experience mysterious symptoms in her late teens: fatigue, headaches, fainting spells. Her concerned parents sent her to a series of doctors, all of whom diagnosed her with hysteria and prescribed various ineffectual treatments. As Nanny's condition worsened, her behavior became more erratic. She lashed out at her family, refused to eat or sleep, and claimed to be possessed by demons. Desperate for a cure, Nanny's parents committed her to the care of Dr. Isaac Baker Brown, a noted gynecological surgeon with a reputation for treating hysteria. Dr. Brown promptly diagnosed Nanny with hysteroepilepsy, a form of hysteria characterized by seizures and sexual mania. His prescribed treatment was clitoridectomy, the surgical removal of the clitoris. Nanny, like so many other women subjected to such barbaric cures, was left physically and emotionally scarred by her ordeal. She spent months recovering from the surgery, only to be told that her hysteria persisted. She was eventually committed to an asylum where she spent the rest of her days in a state of quiet despair. Her once vibrant spirit broken by the cruelties inflicted upon her in the name of medicine. Nani's story is a stark reminder of the ways in which Victorian society pathized and controlled women's bodies and minds. Under the guise of hysteria, any expression of female agency or distress could be ruthlessly suppressed. Women like Nani were subjected to painful, humiliating procedures and stripped of their autonomy, all in the service of maintaining a narrow ideal of docile femininity. And yet, even as some Victorian women were being diagnosed with and treated for hysteria, others were beginning to push back against the medical establishment's mistreatment of women. Among them was Mary Putnam Jacobi, one of the first female physicians in the United States. Jacobi, who studied medicine in Paris and New York, was a vocal critic of the hysteria diagnosis and its use as a tool of oppression against women. In her groundbreaking work, The Question of Rest for Women During Menstruation, Jacobi challenged the prevailing belief that women were inherently weak and sickly due to their reproductive systems. Through meticulous research and statistical analysis, she demonstrated that menstruation was a normal, healthy process that did not require rest or medical intervention. She also argued that the hysteria diagnosis was a catch-all term used to dismiss and control women rather than a legitimate medical condition. Jacob's work, though controversial at the time, helped to chip away at the edifice of hysteria and the broader medicalization of women's bodies in Victorian society. She offered a vision of women as strong, capable, and in control of their own health and destinies. And while the hysteria diagnosis would persist well into the 20th century, Jacobi and other pioneering female physicians helped to lay the groundwork for a more enlightened and empowering approach to women's health care. As we've seen, the Victorian era was a time of immense challenges and constraints for women, from the stifling domestic sphere to the perils of the marriage market to the medicalization of their bodies and minds. But even in the face of such oppression, there were glimmers of hope and resistance. Women like Mary Putnam Jacobi, Mary Ann Evans, and Anne Thacker found ways to defy the expectations placed upon them and carve out new paths for themselves and for future generations. And as the Victorian era drew to a close, the seeds of change that had been planted by these pioneering women began to bear fruit. The fight for women's suffrage, for access to education and professional opportunities, for bodily autonomy and freedom from male control would continue on into the 20th century and beyond. But the groundwork had been laid by the Victorian women who refused to accept the status quo, who pushed back against the constraints placed upon them, and who dared to imagine a different kind of world. As we reflect on the lives of Victorian women from the comfort of our modern vantage point, it's easy to feel a sense of relief and gratitude for how far we've come. We no longer live in a world where women are barred from universities, diagnosed with hysteria for expressing emotion, or bought and sold on the marriage market like cattle. And yet the echoes of the Victorian era still reverberate in our own time. Women continue to face discrimination, harassment, and violence simply for being women. The beauty standards that tyrannize Victorian women may have shifted, but the pressure on women to conform to narrow ideals of femininity remains intense. And while women have made great strides in politics, business, and other male-dominated spheres, the playing field is still far from level. Perhaps then the most enduring legacy of the Victorian women we've encountered is the spirit of resilience and resistance they embodied in the face of unimaginable odds. From Caroline Norton's fierce advocacy for married women's rights, to Florence Nightingale's trailblazing work in nursing, to the quiet rebellions of Anthacare and Mary Ann Evans against the marriage market. These women refused to accept the limitations placed upon them by society. They fought back in ways big and small against the forces that sought to control and diminish them. In doing so, they lit a flame that continues to burn today, a flame of hope, of defiance, of the unshakable conviction that a better world is possible. As we navigate the challenges and constraints of our own time, we can draw strength and inspiration from the Victorian women who came before us. We can honor their legacy by continuing to push back against oppression in all its forms. By refusing to be silenced or sidelined, by daring to imagine a world in which every woman can thrive and flourish on her own terms. The road ahead is long and the obstacles are many. But as we look back on the lives of Victorian women, we are reminded that progress is possible, that change can happen, that even the most entrenched systems of power can be disrupted and transformed. And so we press on in solidarity with our foremothers and in hope for a brighter, more equitable future for all. Of unimaginable odds. As we come to the end of our journey through the world of Victorian women, we are left with a sense of awe at their resilience, their courage, and their unwavering determination in the face of unimaginable odds. From the suffocating confines of the domestic sphere, to the brutal realities of the marriage market, to the medicalization and control of their bodies and minds, Victorian women faced a staggering array of challenges and constraints. And yet, as we've seen, they refused to be silenced or subdued. They found ways, big and small, to resist the forces that sought to control them through their writings, their advocacy, their quiet acts of rebellion. They laid the groundwork for the feminist movements that would emerge in the 20th century and beyond, chipping away at the edifice of patriarchy, one book, one speech, one act of defiance at a time. As we reflect on their legacy, it's easy to feel a sense of gratitude for the progress we've made since the Victorian era. Women today have access to education, professional opportunities, and legal rights that would have been unimaginable to our form. We can vote, own property, control our own bodies and destinies in ways that Victorian women could only dream of. And yet the fight for true gender equality is far from over. Women continue to face discrimination, harassment, and violence in every sphere of life. The beauty standards and expectations of femininity that tyrannized Victorian women may have shifted in form, but they remain just as powerful and oppressive today. And while women have made great strides in breaking into male-dominated fields, the glass ceiling remains stubbornly intact. Perhaps then the most important lesson we can take from the lives of Victorian women is the need for ongoing vigilance and resistance in the face of oppression. As the saying goes, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and that is just as true in the fight for women's rights as it is in any other struggle for justice and equality. So let us honor the legacy of the Victorian women who came before us by continuing to push back against the forces that seek to diminish and control us. Let us take inspiration from their courage, their resilience, and their unwavering belief in a better world. Let us refuse to be silenced or sidelined and instead use our voices and our talents to advocate for change. And let us never forget the sacrifices and struggles of the women who paved the way for us The trailblazers and rebels, the writers and activists, the everyday heroines who refused to accept the limitations placed upon them by society. Their stories may have been lost to history. Their names may have been forgotten, but their spirits live on in every woman who dares to dream of a world in which she can be truly free. As we close this chapter on the lives of Victorian women, let us carry their legacy forward into the future. Let us continue to fight for a world in which every woman can thrive and flourish on her own terms, free from the constraints of gender, class, and oppression. Let us build upon the progress they made and tear down the barriers that still remain. And let us never ever give up on the dream of a truly equal and just society for all. The road ahead may be long and the challenges may be great, but we stand on the shoulders of giants, the brave and brilliant women who came before us and showed us the way. With their example to guide us and their spirit to inspire us, there is no limit to what we can achieve. So let us press on in solidarity and in hope towards a brighter, more beautiful future for us all. The Victorian era represented the pinnacle of Britain's power and prestige on the world stage, driven by the transformative effects of industrialization, global trade, and a vast colonial empire. Yet beneath the prim and proper veneer of Victorian society, with its strict moral code and grandiose ambitions, life for women in this era was often defined by suffocating constraints, limited opportunities, and harsh daily realities. From the stifling confines of the domestic sphere to the disfiguring effects of oppressive fashions, the brutal conditions faced by working-class women, to the total legal subjugation of wives, Victorian women across all walks of life found themselves trapped in a world that demanded everything of them while granting them precious little in return. Even the most basic rights to their own children, their own earnings, their own bodies, were routinely denied to them by a staunchly patriarchal society determined to keep them in a subordinate position. Yet even in the face of such unrelenting opposition, the indomitable spirit of Victorian womanhood could not be completely contained. Through their writings, their activism, their sheer determination, remarkable women in this era fought to expand the sphere of one of the first and most fundamental ways that Victorian society kept women in a subservient position was by restricting them to a strictly limited sphere of influence within the home. The prevailing ideology of separate spheres dictated that a woman's domain was solely the domestic realm. While men enjoyed free rein in the wider world of business, politics, and public life, a woman's primary duties were to manage the household and raise the children, providing a refuge of domestic tranquility for her husband to return to at the end of the day. From the moment they awoke until they retired for the night, Victorian women were expected to devote themselves wholly to these all-consuming responsibilities, suppressing any hint of their own needs or desires in the process. Though this confinement to a life of domesticity was often framed as the natural and divinely ordained role for women, the reality was anything but idyllic. The daily demands of running a household in the Victorian era required backbreaking physical labor without any of the modern conveniences that would later ease this burden. Every surface in the house demanded constant polishing, dusting, and scouring to maintain the immaculate appearance necessary to project an image of respectable gentility. Mountains of laundry had to be soaked, scrubbed, wrung out, and pressed using nothing more than washboards, heavy irons, and elbow grease. And all of this was to be carried out while wearing long, restrictive dresses and tight corsets that made even the simple act of breathing a chore. For women of the growing middle class, eager to prove their rising social status, the pressures and drudgery of household management were compounded by the need to project an image of effortless grace and refinement. Not only did they face the physically taxing work of constant cleaning and child-rearing, but they were also expected to serve as impeccable hostesses and social planners, orchestrating elaborate dinners, teas, and entertainments for their husbands' professional contacts. Managing a team of household servants was a job in and of itself, requiring a woman to serve as the public face of the household, while also privately handling crises ranging from insubordinate maids to leeress footmen. A wife's ability to cultivate an image of domestic bliss and social affability was critical to supporting her husband's career ambitions and ensuring the family's continued climb up the social ladder. Few women embodied the feminine ideal of the angel in the house. Quite like Isabella Beeton, whose 1861 guide, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, served as an exhaustive manual and Bible for Victorian housewives. A paragon of selfless service and welly devotion, Mrs. Beeton offered painstakingly detailed advice on everything from removing stubborn stains to folding the perfect napkin to crafting a dinner menu that would suitably impress influential guests. What readers of her celebrated guide didn't know was that behind her public image of cheery capability, Mrs. Beeton's own life was marred by tragedy and illness. Having contracted syphilis from her philandering husband on her honeymoon, she suffered through multiple miscarriages and stillbirths before dying at the age of just 28. Even as she was dispensing authoritative guidance to women across England about the hallmarks of sound household management, Mrs. Beeton was secretly grappling with the physical and emotional toll of her own personal hardships. Her story exemplified both the impossibly high standards Victorian society set for women and the grim realities lurking beneath the surface of even the most seemingly picture-perfect household. As if the sheer drudgery and unceasing demands of housework weren't taxing enough, Victorian women were further burdened by the oppressive dictates of fashion. The Victorian era marked the apotheosis of a certain kind of exaggerated femininity characterized by almost cartoonishly tiny waists, delicate fainting spells, and a carefully cultivated air of childlike fragility. Perversely, the physical weakness imposed on women by the fashions of the day was taken as proof of their inherent unsuitability for anything beyond a life of passive domesticity. A proper lady was expected to look as if the slightest breeze might bowl her over, her frail constitution and utter helplessness serving as an intoxicating invitation for men to act as her protectors and saviors. The epitome of this feminine ideal was the corset, a rigid, tightly laced undergarment designed to dramatically cinch the waist and thrust the bosom upwards. Constructed from sturdy cotton or even inflexible steel, corsets restricted women's movement and made it difficult to breathe deeply, eat heartily, or engage in any strenuous activity. Fainting, headaches, and digestive ailments were common side effects, as women's internal organs were mercilessly compressed in the quest for the perfect hourglass figure. Housework weren't. Long-term health consequences could be even more severe with the sustained pressure of corsets, blamed for misshapen ribs, weakened abdominal muscles, and even the displacement of the liver. Yet no proper woman would dream of appearing in public or even relaxing in her own home without being fully corseted. Not only would an uncoreted figure be deemed unsightly and unladylike, but it might also invite scandalous speculation about moral looseness and lack of breeding. The crushing pressure of corsets served as an apt metaphor for the constrained position of women in Victorian society as a whole. On top of their strangling undergarments, women were further weighed down by layer upon layer of heavy, cumbersome garments. A fashionable daytime ensemble could easily include a chemise, drawers, corset cover, crinoline or bustle cage, petticoats, bodice and skirt, topped off with outer-ear like jackets, capes and shawls as needed. Simply getting dressed each morning with the assistance of a lady's maid could take well over an hour and leave a woman feeling exhausted before the day had even properly begun. These impractical fashions imposed limitations on women's freedom of movement that went beyond the simply physical. With her mobility severely curtailed by voluminous skirts and tottering heels, a Victorian lady's ability to navigate public spaces on her own was greatly impeded. Merely trying to board a carriage or climb a flight of stairs became a perilous ordeal that required male assistance, reinforcing notions of female dependency and helplessness. For all the discomforts and indignities that fashionable dress inflicted on Victorian women, it did grant them one dubious privilege, the ability to display their family's wealth and social standing for all the world to see. In an era when a woman's value was largely determined by her marriageability, and her marriageability hinged on the social connections and economic resources she could bring to the match, the ability to conspicuously demonstrate her worth through her attire was no small matter. The highest ranks of Victorian society engaged in an endless game of sartorial one-upmanship, each new fashion season bringing fresh opportunities to showcase one's superior taste and virtually unlimited budget. Dresses were confections of sumptuous fabrics like silk, satin, and velvet, lavishly embellished with ruffles, flounces, lace, and fringe. A particularly well-heeled lady might think nothing of spending a sum equivalent to a clerk's annual wages on a single gown for an important social occasion. Of course, keeping up such appearances was a full-time occupation in itself, demanding an army of specialized assistants, including ladies' maids, hairdressers, milliners, dressmakers, and fashion advisors. Woe betide the woman who failed to keep up with the whims of fashion or dared to be seen wearing the same dress twice in one season. Whispers and side eyes from her social circle were sure to follow. For women of more modest means, the costly demands of fashionable dress could be a source of unending anxiety and self-denial. A middle-class housewife might scrimp and save for months to afford a single new gown, knowing that her family's social ambitions rested on her ability to maintain a respectable appearance. Women who couldn't afford to hire help were faced with the unenviable task of laundering and mending these complex garments on their own, a painstaking chore that only added to their domestic burdens. The rigid standards of Victorian beauty went beyond exaggerated hourglass figures and impractical frocks to encompass every aspect of a woman's deportment and appearance. At a time when a clear peaches and cream complexion was taken as a sign of refinement and delicacy, many women went to dangerous lengths to achieve an ivory pal. Although Queen Victoria publicly declared the use of cosmetics vulgar, and by extension implied they were the province of actresses and prostitutes, a roaring trade nonetheless existed in lead-based face powders, mercury-laden skin lighteners, and arsenic complexion wafers. Ironically, the very cosmetic products women turned to in pursuit of an alabaster glow often contained toxic ingredients that ate away at their skin and caused tooth loss, hair loss, and a host of other health problems. Perhaps no one better embodied the perils of trying to live up to an impossible standard of beauty than Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Famed across Europe for her thick, floor-length chestnut hair, slim build and finely chiseled features, was resented by her mother-in-law for being too beautiful to be an empress. In her quest to maintain an eternally youthful, slender appearance, devoted several hours each day to her beauty regimen, undergoing lengthy massages and hair grooming sessions, performing rigorous exercise routines, and subsisting on a near-starvation diet. At a time when a clear peaches and cream complexion. As she aged, she became increasingly reclusive and anxious, demanding that no mirrors be placed in her chambers and refusing to have any portraits painted of her. Although was celebrated as the ultimate icon of aristocratic refinement and feminine beauty, in truth her life was a chronicle of thwarted ambitions, family tragedies, and intense physical and emotional strain. In trying to mold herself into an ornamental showpiece whose value lay entirely in her looks, she found herself trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, forever chasing after an image of perfection that left no room for her humanity. The streets of Victorian London bustled with life. Horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestones, newspaper boys shouted the latest headlines, and bewisered gentlemen in top hats strode past with canes in hand. But amidst the sights and sounds of this rapidly modernizing city, one half of the population remained tucked away behind closed doors, their voices muffled and their troubles unseen. For women in Victorian England, life was a series of harsh constraints and heavy expectations, their worlds confined to the domestic sphere. A proper Victorian lady's sole purpose was to be an angel in the house, a virtuous, submissive wife and mother whose life revolved around the home. From the moment she awoke until she drifted off to sleep, her day was filled with a never-ending litany of household duties. She oversaw the kitchen and the cooking, ensuring that meals were prepared promptly and to her husband's liking. She directed a staff of servants managing their work with a firm but ladylike hand, and she laboured over the mending and sewing, her nimble fingers stitching by candlelight into the night. But the work of the Victorian housewife was not merely physical, it was also social and emotional. A woman was expected to be the beating heart of the home, creating a warm and welcoming environment for her family. She planned dinner parties and tea socials, spending hours carefully crafting guest lists and menus that would reflect well upon her husband's status. She fretted over the children's moral upbringing, their education, and their prospects, knowing that their futures rested heavily on her shoulders. It was an exhausting existence, one that left little room for personal fulfillment or self-care. But there was one Victorian woman who seemed to have it all figured out, Mrs. Isabella Beeton, the Martha Stewart of her day. Born in 1836, Isabella was a curious and intelligent child who loved to read and write. She married a wealthy publisher named Samuel Beeton when she was just 20 years old, and soon found herself thrust into the role of Victorian housewife. But rather than buckling under the pressure, Isabella thrived. She threw herself into learning everything she could about cooking, cleaning, and household management, and began writing articles for her husband's magazines, sharing her knowledge with other women. In 1861, at the tender age of 25, she published her masterwork, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. The book was a sensation, selling over 60,000 copies in its first year alone. It contained over 900 recipes as well as detailed instructions on everything from budgeting to childcare to the proper way to fold a napkin. For Victorian women, it was a lifeline, a guide to help them navigate the complex and often contradictory expectations placed upon them. But what readers didn't know was that behind Mrs. Beeton's perfect facade lay a woman struggling with chronic illness. Isabella suffered from debilitating migraines and digestive issues and was frequently bedridden for days at a time. She wrote much of her famous book while in constant pain, propped up on pillows with a writing desk across her knees. In many ways, Isabella's story encapsulates the plight of the Victorian woman, outwardly poised and capable, but inwardly strained under the weight of societal pressure. The expectations placed on women were not just confining, but often physically harmful. The cult of ideal womanhood demanded that ladies maintain a delicate, fragile beauty, their figures molded by whalebone corsets and layers upon layers of heavy fabric. The ideal Victorian silhouette was an exaggerated hourglass with a tiny wasp waist that could only be achieved through tight lacing. Women cinched their corsets tighter and tighter, sometimes even removing ribs to achieve the desired shape. The consequences were disastrous for their health. Compressed organs, restricted breathing, and even deformities of the skeleton. But to be fashionable was a woman's duty, and to neglect one's appearance was seen as a moral failing. Wealthy women changed their outfits multiple times a day, requiring the assistance of a lady's maid to navigate the intricacies of petticoats, bustles, and crinolines. They endured the pinch of too small shoes and the scrape of stiff collars, all in the name of presenting a pleasing picture to the world, to the writing desk across her knees. In many ways, Isabella's story the pressure to be beautiful even extended to the skin. Pale, translucent complexions were prized as a sign of delicacy and refinement, and women went to great lengths to avoid the sun's darkening rays. They swathed themselves in shawls and gloves and carried parasols to protect their lily-white skin. Some even resorted to dangerous cosmetics to achieve the desired look, smoothing lead-based powders onto their faces and eating chalk to maintain a sickly pallor. One woman who took this obsession with beauty to extremes was Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known to her adoring public as Sisi. Born into Bavarian royalty in 1837, Sisi was famed for her gorgeous waist-length chestnut hair, her porcelain skin, and her impossibly slender figure. She was seen as the ultimate embodiment of feminine beauty, and her image was fetishized throughout Europe. But behind closed doors, Sisi was a deeply troubled woman grappling with the pressures of her role. She was desperately unhappy in her marriage to Emperor Franz Joseph and found the rigid etiquette of the Viennese court stifling. She coped by retreating into a world of punishing beauty rituals, exercising fanatically, and eating barely enough to survive. Sisi spent hours each day tending to her hair and skin, applying secret concoctions made of crushed strawberries, raw veal and lard. She laced her corset ever tighter, at one point achieving an astonishing 16-inch waist, and she pushed her body to the limit with long hikes and fencing sessions, even when pregnant or ill. To the outside world, Sisi was a fairy tale empress, a romantic heroine come to life. But in reality, she was a prisoner of her own myth, trapped by the very beauty that had made her famous. Her story is a tragic example of how the Victorian cult of femininity could consume a woman's life, reducing her to nothing more than a decorative object. And for most women, even achieving that level of ornamental status was an impossible dream. The vast majority of Victorian women were not wealthy aristocrats or royal empresses, but ordinary middle and working class ladies with few options in life. The respectable roles open to them were severely limited. They could become wives and mothers, or they could resign themselves to the lonely, pitted existence of the spinster. There were almost no opportunities for women to pursue higher education or meaningful careers. Even the most basic schooling was focused on creating proper young ladies, not scholars or professionals. Girls were taught feminine accomplishments like needlework, watercolor painting, and conversational French rather than math or science. The ideal was a woman who could entertain guests in the drawing room and manage a household, not one with intellectual ambitions. A woman who dared to dream of a life beyond the domestic sphere faced an uphill battle, as the famous nurse Florence Nightingale discovered. Born to a wealthy British family in 1820, Florence was a bright and curious child who longed to make a difference in the world. But her aspirations of becoming a nurse were seen as shockingly improper for a lady of her class. Florence's parents refused to allow her to pursue medical training, believing it would ruin her marriage prospects. They expected her to settle down with a respectable husband and start a family, not traipse off to filthy hospitals to tend to strangers. But Florence was determined to follow her calling and eventually wore down her family's resistance. She endured grueling training in Germany, where she learned the latest techniques in hygiene and patient care. And when the Crimean War broke out in 1853, she leapt at the chance to put her skills to use. She travelled to the front lines with a team of 38 nurses and found conditions in the army hospitals appalling, filthy, overcrowded, and lacking in even the most basic supplies. Florence worked tirelessly to improve sanitation and nutrition and to provide emotional comfort to the wounded soldiers. She became known as the Lady with the Lamp, making her rounds late into the night to check on her patients. Her efforts helped reduce the death rate in the hospitals by 2/3, and she returned to England a national heroine. But even with her newfound fame, Florence struggled to be taken seriously as a medical professional. Many male doctors resented her authority and questioned her methods, and she faced constant pushback from the military establishment. She eventually retreated into a life of seclusion, battling chronic illness and depression. Florence's story is a testament to the incredible strength and determination of Victorian women who fought against the odds to make their mark on the world. But for most, even the chance to fight those battles was out of reach. The pressure to conform, to fit the mold of the proper lady, was overwhelming and all-consuming. And nowhere was that pressure more apparent than in the rituals of courtship and marriage. She travelled to the front lines with a team of 38 nurses and found conditions in the army hospitals appalling for a Victorian woman. Her wedding day was the culmination of years of careful preparation and strategic manoeuvring, a make or break moment that would determine the course of the rest of her life. She was expected to marry well, to snag a husband who could provide for her financially and elevate her social standing. The process of finding that perfect mate was a complex and often humiliating one. Young women of marriageable age were trotted out at an endless series of balls, dances, and social gatherings, paraded before potential suitors like prize heirs at a county fair. They were expected to be charming, but chaste, witty, but not too clever, beautiful, but not vain. The slightest misstep could ruin a woman's reputation and her chances at a good match. She had to navigate the treacherous waters of flirtation and courtship without being seen as fast or improper, a wrong word, a misplaced glance, an accidental touch. Any of these could brand her as damaged goods in the eyes of society. For women who didn't fit the conventional mold of beauty, the marriage market could be a brutal and demoralizing experience. The writers Anne Thacker and Mary Ann Evans, who wrote under the pseudonym George Eliot, both penned poignant sketches of the plight of the ugly duckling in Victorian society. In her essay, Toilers and Spinsters, there describes the superfluous women who are left on the shelf, doomed to a life of gentle poverty and social isolation. She writes of the pressure to be charming and marketable and the crushing disappointment of being passed over for prettier, more vivacious girls. Evans, in her novel Middlemarch, creates a brilliant but plain heroine named Dorothea Brookie, who longs for a life of intellectual fulfillment, but she is pushed into a disastrous marriage with a much older man. Her dreams of scholarly pursuits crushed under the weight of domestic duties. For the lucky women who did manage to secure a husband, their troubles were far from over. Marriage in Victorian England was a decidedly one-sided affair, with all the power and privilege granted to the male spouse. Under the legal doctrine of cover, a married woman's identity was completely subsumed by her husband's. She became, in essence, his property with no rights to her own body, her children, or her possessions. A woman was expected to submit to her husband's will in all things, even when it came to the most intimate aspects of her life. Marital assault was not recognized as a crime, and a man was seen as entitled to his wife's sexual favors whenever he desired. For women in abusive marriages there was little recourse. Divorce was almost impossible to obtain and carried a heavy social stigma. The story of Caroline Norton, a beautiful and talented writer, illustrates the injustice of the Victorian marriage laws. Trapped in a miserable union with a violent drunkard, Caroline was denied access to her own earnings and barred from seeing her children when she finally left him. She channeled her grief and rage into a campaign to change the laws, writing passionate letters and pamphlets arguing for women's rights. Her efforts helped lead to the passage of the Custody of Infants Act in 1839, which gave mothers the right to petition for custody of their children under the age of 7. And her later work helped pave the way for the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, which made divorce more accessible and allowed women to keep their own property in a separation. But while Caroline's story had a relatively happy ending, for most Victorian women, marriage was a life sentence of drudgery and sacrifice. And the greatest sacrifice of all was often on the altar of motherhood. In an era without reliable birth control, married women faced the constant spectre of pregnancy, their bodies ravaged by the toll of bearing and burying child after child. Childbirth itself was a harrowing and dangerous ordeal with no pain relief and often unsanitary conditions. Women routinely died in labor or from infections contracted during the birthing process. And even if they survived, they faced the heartbreak of losing their babies to disease, malnutrition, or simple bad luck. Queen Victoria herself was no stranger to the sorrows of motherhood. Though she famously adored her husband, Prince Albert, and took great joy in her 9 children, she also suffered devastating losses. Her second daughter, Princess Alice, died at the age of 35 from diphtheria contracted while nursing her own sick child. And her youngest son, Prince Leopold, was a haemophiliac who died at just 30 years old. from a brain hemorrhage. In her letters and diaries, Victoria writes movingly of the anguish of outliving her children and of the burden of being a mother in an age of such precarity. She also struggled with the demands of royal motherhood, feeling constrained and overwhelmed by the constant pressure to produce heirs and manage a large household. Of motherhood. In an era without reliable birth control, married women faced for less privileged women, the strains of motherhood were even more acute. Working-class mothers had to balance childcare with grueling factory labor or domestic service, often leaving their infants in the care of older siblings or inexperienced neighbors. They returned to work mere days after giving birth, their bodies still raw and bleeding because they could not afford to lose their jobs. And for those women who could not or did not want to have children, the stigma was intense. Spinsters were seen as failed women, their barrenness a mark of shame and inadequacy. They were often relegated to the margins of society, living on the charity of family members or scraping by as underpaid governesses or companions. The plight of the Victorian spinster is captured poignantly in the novel Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. The book follows the lives of a group of unmarried women in a small English village. Their days filled with the small dramas of tea parties and gossip. But beneath the surface, there is a deep sadness and sense of missed opportunity, a yearning for a life that has been denied to them. Gaskell herself knew the pain of being a single woman in Victorian society. She married relatively late in life at the age of 31 and had to endure years of pity and condescension from friends and family. And when her husband died just 6 years later, leaving her with 2 young daughters to support, she turned to writing as a means of survival. For Gaskell and other women writers of the period, literature was a way to explore the inner lives of women, to give voice to their struggles and their triumphs. But even in the world of the arts, women faced significant barriers and prejudices. They were seen as inferior to male writers, their work dismissed as sentimental or trivial. Many female authors like the Bronte sisters and Mary Ann Evans published under male pseudonyms to avoid the stigma of being a lady novelist. They knew that their writing would not be taken seriously if it was known to come from a woman's pen. And they feared the backlash that could come from stepping outside the narrow confines of feminine propriety. But despite the obstacles, Victorian women writers produced some of the most enduring and influential literature of the era. From the Gothic romances of the Brontes to the social realism of Gaskell and Eliot, their work challenged the prevailing stereotypes of women and explored the complex realities of their lives. And it wasn't just in literature that women were making their mark in the realm of social reform. Women like Florence Nightingale and Josephine Butler were fighting to improve the lives of the most vulnerable and marginalized members of society. Their efforts laid the groundwork for the women's suffrage movement and the broader fight for gender equality in the 20th century. But for most Victorian women, the struggle for self-determination was a quiet, personal one, waged in the confines of their own homes and hearts. They faced a world that was hostile to their dreams and desires that sought to constrain them at every turn. And yet they found ways to resist, to carve out small spaces of freedom and fulfillment in the face of overwhelming odds. In their diaries and letters, in their art and their activism, Victorian women left a legacy of resilience and courage that continues to inspire us today. Their stories remind us of the incredible progress that has been made in the fight for women's rights and of the work that still remains to be done. As we look back on the Victorian era from the vantage point of the 21st century, it can be easy to feel a sense of superiority, to marvel at the backwards attitudes and oppressive customs of a bygone age. But we must also remember that the struggles of Victorian women are not so far removed from our own. Even today, women continue to face discrimination and violence, to be held to impossible standards of beauty and behavior, to have their voices silenced and their experiences dismissed. The fight for true equality is an ongoing. As we've seen, life for Victorian women was marked by restriction, repression, and unrelenting demands. Even aristocratic women, despite their relative comfort and privilege, were still tightly confined to narrow domestic and social roles that gave them little room to pursue their own interests or ambitions. One such woman was Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known to her family as Sisi. Born into Bavarian royalty in 1837, the strikingly beautiful Elizabeth caught the eye of the young Emperor Franz Joseph III of Austria when she was just 15. The two soon married, and overnight Elizabeth was thrust into the role of Empress, a position that came with immense pressure and scrutiny. As a young bride, Elizabeth struggled to adapt to the rigid etiquette and strict ceremonial routines of the Habsburg court. She chafed at the constant monitoring by attendants and resented the overbearing influence of her mother-in-law, Princess Sophie, far removed from our own. Even today, women continue to face discrimination and violence, to be held to impossible standards of beauty. Elizabeth sought solace in a zealous beauty regimen, spending hours each day tending to her ankle-length hair, pinched waist, and alabaster complexion. Over time, maintaining her renowned beauty became an obsession for the Empress. She wrapped herself in damp cloths at night to preserve her trim figure and subsisted on a diet of milk, eggs, and broth to keep her weight at a mere 110 pounds, despite her 5 feet 8 inches frame. Elizabeth spent hours every day exercising vigorously on rings and bars to maintain her slender build. As she withdrew further into her fixations, Elizabeth began to neglect her duties as wife and mother. She left her children for months at a time to travel compulsively across Europe and North Africa, always with an entourage of hairdressers, Greek tutors, and a personal gym in tow. Struggling with what some historians believe was depression and anorexia, she became increasingly eccentric and melancholic. Though Elizabeth resented the public fetishization of her appearance, she also relied on her beauty as a source of influence and independence in a court that granted her little official power. As she aged and her legendarily trim waist began to thicken, she only withdrew further from the public eye, hiding her figure behind fans, face veils, and parasols. In 1898, while walking along the promenade in Geneva, the 60-year-old empress was stabbed through the heart by an Italian anarchist. It's said that her corseted waist was so slim and the wound so small that at first no one noticed she had been injured. She collapsed and died moments later, a poignant symbol of the gilded cage in which she had spent her life. Elizabeth's tragic story illustrates the immense physical and emotional toll that the era's rigid feminine ideals took on women. Though she enjoyed all the comforts and privileges of her rank, she was still in many ways a prisoner of her celebrated beauty and the limited outlets permitted to women of her station. Of course, ordinary women without Elizabeth's resources had even fewer options for independence and self-expression. For For the vast majority of Victorian women, there was really only one socially acceptable path: marriage. But as we'll see, even this came with its own set of suffocating constraints and indignities. The process of husband hunting was a complex and often humiliating ritual marked by the pageantry of balls, calling cards, and afternoon teas. Well-bred young ladies were expected to navigate this delicate courtship dance under the hawkish eyes of chaperones, careful to follow the intricate, unspoken rules of propriety and flirtation. Those who went unmarried into their mid-20s risked being seen as undesirable old maids and faced increasing social isolation as well as financial insecurity in a world with few respectable employment options for women. The pressure to find a husband of good social and economic standing was immense, as marriage was viewed as the defining achievement of a woman's life. This harsh reality is vividly captured in many novels of the era populated by heroines who face dwindling marital prospects and social ostracization for the crime of being plain poor or overly intelligent. Authors like Anne Theacare and Mary Ann Evans, who both struggled on the Victorian marriage market themselves, provide unsparing depictions of this punishing social ritual in their work. In her 1852 novel The History of Henry Esmond, the paints a cutting portrait of the marriage market through the eyes of her anonymous hero. As a shy, bookish young woman without much of a doughy, the narrator woefully observes the minations of the London season, where cold calculation is cloaked in the language of romance. She watches wealthier, better connected girls scheme to ensnare desirable husbands, while she and her fellow ugly ducklings are left to warm the chairs at dances ignored by the marrying men. Without beauty, charm, or fortune to barter, she muses. An awkward young woman is a mere encumbrance, which everyone is eager to be rid of. Mary Ann Evans, better known by her masculine pen name, George Eliot, also drew on her own painful experiences as an unattractive woman in her work. Although her soaring intellect would eventually make her one of the most celebrated authors of the era, as a young woman, Evans keenly felt her exclusion from the marriage market. In a letter to a friend, she describes attending a London dance where she felt supremely uncomfortable and out of place among the fashionable throng. I had the consciousness that my attire and my self-possession were not up to the mark, she wrote, and I had no one to take me in hand and uphold my dignity. That sense of exposure and inadequacy is palpable in Eliot's depiction of Gwendolen Harle, the ambitious but insecure heroine of her novel Daniel Deronda. Though beautiful and accomplished, Gwendolen is acutely aware that her lack of fortune puts when a socially desirable suitor begins to court her, she agonizes over how to respond, torn between her yearning for independence and her fear of ending up a penniless spinster. No one who has not been in the position of a young woman looking for a rich husband can understand the depth of disgust and resistance she may feel. Eliot writes, capturing the quiet desperation of the marriage market. For women like Waylin and the Wallflower and countless real-life Victorian brides, the sought-after wedding day was not a romantic culmination, but a kind of surrender. In a world that offered women so few paths to security or self-determination, donning the wife's ring and veil often felt more like a trap than a triumph. And in fact, Victorian marriage could become a kind of gilded cage for many women who found themselves legally and economically subsumed by their husbands. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman had no independent legal identity. She could not own property, control her own earnings, or even have guardianship over her children. For women unlucky enough to find themselves yoked to abusive or dissolute husbands, this complete legal dependence could spell disaster. With divorce prohibitively difficult and expensive to obtain, many wives simply had to endure mistreatment with no real recourse. One woman who took on the injustice of Victorian marital law was Caroline Norton, a society beauty and acclaimed author who found herself in a nightmare marriage. After her violent, vindictive husband George kicked her out and denied her access to her 3 young children, Norton discovered she had no legal right to see them. Incensed, she channeled her anguish into activism, becoming a vocal advocate for women's custodial rights. She penned impassioned pamphlets and open letters arguing that motherhood was a sacred duty that should not be subject to the whims of cruel or careless husbands. Norton's tireless campaigning helped push through the Custody of Infants Act in 1839, which gave mothers the right to petition for custody of their children up to the age of 7 and access thereafter. It was a groundbreaking first step in establishing women's parental rights, though true equality was still a long way off. Norton next set her sights on the question of women's property rights, another area where wives were utterly dependent on male beneficence. Under cover, any wealth or property a woman brought into a marriage immediately became her husband's to dispose of as he pleased. A wife had no right to her own inheritances or earnings, even if she was the sole breadwinner. This injustice was laid bare in Norton's own experience when her arranged husband vindictively laid claim to the royalties from her successful books, leaving her unable to support herself and her children. "I was working for my bread, and the law takes my bread away from me," she wrote in fury. Again, Norton threw herself into the fight, lobbying MPs, writing articles, and gathering testimony from women who had been left destitute by feckless or greedy husbands. After years of dogged campaigning, her efforts bore fruit in the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, which granted wives limited control over their own earnings and inheritances. It was another crucial victory, though married women would not gain full property rights on par with men until 1882, 5 years after Norton's death. Her legacy, however, was sealed as one of the earliest and most effective advocates for Victorian women's legal and economic emancipation. Of course, the law was not the only force constraining women in marriage. The physical perils and indignities of constant childbearing also took an immense toll. In an age without reliable contraception or medically sound birthing practices, the Victorian feminine ideal of the angel in the house, the devoted, submissive, ever-nurturing wife and mother, placed enormous pressure on women to bear as many children as possible, even at the cost of their health and autonomy. With little understanding of women's reproductive systems and scant regard for their comfort, doctors routinely discouraged any attempt to limit family size. As a result, most married women spent their prime years in a state of almost constant pregnancy, birth, and nursing, their bodies never fully their own. Well into the late 19th century, the average woman could expect to bear 6 or 7 live children over the course of her fertile years, not counting miscarriages and stillbirths. Wealthier women were somewhat shielded from the most punishing physical aspects of motherhood by the labors of wet nurses and nannies. But for the majority of women, the sheer bodily strain of perpetual pregnancy, birth, and breastfeeding could be debilitating, even deadly. Legal and economic emancipation. Of course, the law was not the only force constraining women in marriage. The physical perils and indignities of constant childbearing also took an immense toll. In an era before antibiotics, even routine birth carried a serious risk of life-threatening childbed fever, while complications like preeclampsia and obstructed labor could easily prove fatal without proper medical intervention. According to some estimates, maternal mortality ran as high as 15% in some crowded urban areas. Even for women who survived their pregnancies and births, the physical aftermath could be grim. Lacerations, infections, and the prolapsed organs associated with multiple vaginal deliveries were commonplace. So too was the pain of cracked nipples and mastitis from the relentless demands of nursing. For all the hallowed rhetoric venerating mothers, actual maternal care was often primitive and inadequate. Doctors who were overwhelmingly male tended to be dismissive of female complaints, chalking up everything from postpartum incontinence to crippling pelvic pain as the natural consequences of women's destiny. This casual disdain for women's suffering is epitomized by J. Marion Sims, the so-called father of modern gynecology, who performed gruesome experimental surgeries on enslaved African American women without anesthesia or their consent in the mid-19th century. Sims, who believed that black women had a higher pain tolerance that made them ideal surgical specimens, invented the modern speculum through his grim work. But he thought nothing of the agony he inflicted on his powerless subjects, many of whom endured up to 30 operations to satisfy his curiosity. For Victorian women of all classes and colours, then the female body was in many ways a battleground where male authority and feminine submission played out in stark, often brutal ways. Whether through the onslaught of endless pregnancies or the cold indifference of male physicians, women were constantly reminded of their second as physical status. Perhaps no woman embodied this tension between idealized motherhood and punishing female reality more than Queen Victoria herself. Though she would lend her name to the era and in many ways defined its conservative feminine ideal, Victoria chafed at the loss of autonomy that came with the duties of wife and mother. Deeply in love with her husband, Prince Albert, Victoria nevertheless resented the way her treasured time with him was constantly interrupted by the demands of pregnancy and childbirth. Over the course of their 21-year marriage, she would bear 9 children, at one point spending over a decade continuously pregnant or nursing. In her diaries and letters, Victoria makes no secret of her distaste for the physical strain and indignities of childbearing. She describes her first pregnancy as a kind of living death, like a dog's existence, troubled with strange thoughts and desires, mewed up in a wretched cage. After a particularly grueling labour with her 8th child, during which doctors gave her chloroform against her wishes, the Queen raged in her diary. What makes me most angry is that I am being forced to do this, and that no one considers what it costs me to suffer so and be deprived of my husband's comfort. For Victoria, motherhood was a kind of paradox. She adored her children and felt a strong sense of maternal duty. But she also keenly felt the loss of self that came with the role. As a queen and a public figure, she was constantly on display. Her pregnancies and postpartum periods fodder for gossip and scrutiny. After Albert's sudden death in 1861, Victoria fell into a deep depression that only compounded her ambivalence about motherhood. Overwhelmed by grief and the demands of ruling alone, she withdrew from her children, leaving them to the care of nannies and tutors for long stretches. Her relationship with her eldest son, Bertie, who stood to inherit the throne, was especially fraught. Victoria alternately neglected and nitpicked the sensitive boy, frustrated that he could not live up to the impossible standard of his dead father. "You are not fit to succeed him," she cruelly told Bertie when he displeased her. In many ways, Victoria's struggles reflect the impossible bind of Victorian motherhood writ large. Women were expected to subsume their identities completely in their children to find total fulfillment in the holy duties of nurturing and self-sacrifice. At the same time, they enjoyed little support or consideration for the very real physical and emotional costs of this all-consuming role. For working-class mothers who had no royal retinue to fall back on, this double burden was even more punishing. Many had no choice but to leave their infants with slapdash baby farms or older siblings while they labored in factories and workshops. Their meager wages the only thing standing between their families and the poor house. These women faced the cruel irony of Victorian morality, which venerated the sanctity of motherhood while providing no social safety net for those who performed its most essential labor. Relationship with her eldest son, Bertie, who stood to inherit the countless innocent lives would be destroyed by the fear and paranoia unleashed by this twisted fusion of folklore and religious fervor. At the center of this storm of superstition was a figure who came to embody the darkest aspects of medieval belief in the supernatural, the witch. The archetype of the wicked witch, a malevolent, typically female sorcerer, who cohorted with demons and wreaked havoc on good Christian folk, had deep roots in medieval folklore. Long before the first witch trials of the early modern era, tales of diabolical witchcraft circulated throughout Europe. These stories drew on a rich brew of pagan superstitions, biblical traditions, and misogynistic stereotypes. In the popular imagination, witches were seen as the antithesis of proper Christian womanhood instead of being chaste, obedient, and pious. They were portrayed as lustful, rebellious, and utterly depraved. Accused witches were often poor, elderly women who lived on the margins of society. Their very existence seemed to threaten the paternalistic order of the medieval world. The late Middle Ages saw an upsurge in fear and fascination with witchcraft, fueled in part by the trauma of the Black Death and the social upheaval of the period. As the old feudal order crumbled and traditional beliefs were challenged by new ideas, many clung ever more tightly to superstition as a source of certainty in an uncertain world. It was in this charged atmosphere that witch trials began to proliferate across Europe. The first major outbreak occurred in the French-Swiss border region in the early 15th century. Over the next 200 years, witch hunts would claim an estimated 50,000 lives, the vast majority of them women. The methods used to root out suspected witches were as cruel as they were absurd. Accused women were subjected to brutal interrogations, often under torture, until they confessed to fantastical crimes like flying to Sabbaths, copulating with demons, and blighting crops. Once a confession was extracted, the alleged witch was typically sentenced to death by burning at the stake. One of the most influential texts in the burgeoning field of witch hunting was the Formicarius, or Book of Ants, written by the German theologian Johannes Nieder in the 1430s. Nieder was a Dominican friar and religious reformer who saw the fight against witchcraft as part of a broader crusade to purify the church and stamp out heresy. In the Formicarius, Nieder paints a lurid picture of witches as depraved servants of Satan who renounced their baptism and engaged in all manner of unspeakable acts. He describes witches flying to nocturnal gatherings where they worshipped the devil, desecrated the Eucharist, and plotted evil deeds against their neighbors. Nida's vivid accounts of witches, Sabbaths, and malefic magic helped to solidify the stereotype of the diabolical witch in the medieval imagination. His work was widely read and cited by later witch hunters who used it as a kind of field guide for identifying and prosecuting suspected sorcerers. But even as the Formicarius fueled the fires of witch-hunting fervor, it also betrayed a deep unease with the very superstitions it sought to combat. Nida was a learned man steeped in the scholastic tradition of rational inquiry. He recognized that many accusations of witchcraft were rooted in ignorance, malice, or delusion. In one passage, Nida relates the story of a woman who was accused of witchcraft after a neighbor dreamed that she had cursed him. Under torture, the woman confessed to a host of fantastical crimes, from flying on a broomstick to giving birth to a litter of monstrous toads. Yet Nida expresses skepticism about the veracity of these claims, noting that they were extracted under duress and bore all the hallmarks of false confession. This ambivalence reflects the complex attitudes of medieval intellectuals toward witchcraft and superstition. On the one hand, theologians like Nida saw belief in sorcery as a dangerous delusion, a relic of pagan ignorance that needed to be stamped out. On the other hand, they couldn't entirely dismiss the power of the supernatural, which was woven into the very fabric of Christian doctrine. After all, if God could work miracles and demons could possess the unwary, who was to say that witches couldn't fly through the night or blight crops with their curses? The line between orthodoxy and superstition was often blurry, and even the most learned clergymen could find themselves caught up in the fever dream of the witch hunt. As the medieval world gave way to the early modern era, the witch craze reached its terrible apex. The publication of the notorious Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, in 1487 codified the methods of witch hunting and helped to spread the contagion of superstition across Europe. Over the next 2 centuries, thousands of women and some men would be tortured, hanged, or burned alive for the crime of witchcraft. Under duress and bore over 250,000 people in total converging on the National Mall like a rising tide of hope. And yet, there was no chaos. Despite the government's fear of riots and unrest, the scene was astonishingly calm. Volunteers directed foot traffic. The Red Cross handed out water. Groups sang freedom songs, held hands, and cheered as new marchers arrived. You could hear gospel choirs near the reflecting pool and chants of jobs and freedom echoing off the marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities joined in too: Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. But no one was there for autographs. They were there to witness history and lend their voices to a cause bigger than any one person. The crowd was orderly but energized. There was no pushing, no looting, no violence. Instead, there was a shared understanding that this wasn't just a protest, it was a sacred moment. For many Black Americans, just standing on the mall felt like a quiet act of revolution. To be seen, to be counted, to say, we are here in front of the same Lincoln Memorial where the great emancipator sat in stone. It was a full circle moment, generations in the making. At exactly noon, the official program began. Leaders took the stage one by one, each representing different organizations, ideologies, and regions, but united in message. Speakers demanded equal pay, desegregated schools, a living wage, and an end to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang. Marian Anderson, who had once been banned from singing at Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang for thousands beneath the open sky. As the hours passed, the tension grew, not from unrest, but from anticipation. The man everyone was waiting for had not yet spoken. And when he did, the world would stop, listen, and remember. The march wasn't just making history. It was becoming legend minute by minute. By mid-afternoon, the crowd had grown quiet, not because they were tired, but because they knew what was coming. Standing in the shade of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He wore a dark suit, a neatly tied tie, and an expression of deep calm that barely concealed the fire building inside him. He carried prepared remarks, typed and written collaboratively with his advisors the night before. But what the world would remember wasn't what had been typed. It was what came from his heart. He began with measured intensity, outlining the grim realities of segregation, police violence, and broken promises. 100 years later, he said, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro is still not free. His voice rose and fell like a sermon. He used repetition, rhythm, and silence, not as fillers, but as instruments. The crowd listened in rapt attention, some nodding, some wiping away tears, others holding signs that simply read now. But it was what happened next that changed the tone of the entire event, and arguably the trajectory of the civil rights movement itself. Standing just behind King was gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier that day. She suddenly cried out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And King did. He set aside his notes, gripped the podium, and launched into a passage he'd delivered before, but never like this. "I have a dream," he said, and the crowd leaned in. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Each phrase rang louder, clearer, more resolute. "I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." It wasn't a speech anymore, it was a vision, a prayer, a lightning bolt through history. By the time King closed with the words, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd erupted, applause, tears, shouts of joy. They knew they had just witnessed something more than oratory. They had heard prophecy. The power of the March on Washington wasn't just in the speeches or the music, it was in the people. The sheer scale of humanity gathered that day was overwhelming. They came from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, and everywhere in between. Some were seasoned activists who had marched a dozen times before. Others had never left their hometowns until now. They packed lunches, rode buses for over 20 hours, and slept in their church clothes just to be there. Many were ordinary people, maids, teachers, steel workers, postal clerks, who saw themselves not as political figures but as witnesses. They didn't just want change, they were the change. There were also children in the crowd, young black girls with ribbons in their hair, boys with hand-drawn signs, parents hoisted toddlers onto their shoulders so they could see the Lincoln Memorial in the distance and hear the speaker voices carried over loudspeakers. To them, this wasn't just an event, It was the beginning of a new world. Some faces stood out. There was a young John Lewis, just 23 years old, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. His original speech had been so fiery, so uncompromising, that senior leaders asked him to tone it down minutes before he went on stage. He agreed, but just barely. His call for radical change still shook the crowd. And then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman to speak that day, not on her own behalf, but reading a prepared statement on behalf of other civil rights women. The organizers had faced criticism for sidelining female voices. Bates's brief but powerful message underscored a harsh reality. Even within a movement about equality, some voices still struggled to be heard. Also present were union organizers, rabbis, nuns, priests, and students of every background. They didn't all agree on strategy. Some favored King's nonviolence. Others leaned toward Malcolm X's more militant posture. But for that one day, those differences didn't matter. Unity won out. It was a visual symphony of American possibility. White and black hands linked in solidarity. Freedom. Now buttons pinned to chests and the sound of 250,000 souls breathing as one. The faces in the crowd weren't just watching history unfold. They were shaping it, and none of them would ever forget what they saw. While the world saw unity, inspiration, and poetic justice on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial behind the scenes, the March on Washington was anything but simple. What looked like a perfectly synchronized movement was in truth held together with string, sweat, and a lot of last-minute compromise. Bayard Rustin, the chief architect of the march, had to battle not just logistics but politics. He was constantly under scrutiny, not just because he was openly gay and a former communist, but because some civil rights leaders feared his identity would be used to discredit the movement. In fact, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had once threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of being lovers if King didn't remove Rustin from an earlier campaign. That threat haunted every stage of planning. Then there was the issue of women's voices. Despite the critical roles played by women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, none were invited to deliver major speeches on their own. Rosa Parks was in the crowd that day, revered by all, but she was not given the microphone. Behind the powerful optics of the march lay the truth. The movement still struggled with its own hierarchies and blind spots. Even within the big six organizations, friction bubbled. SNCC leaders were growing increasingly disillusioned with the slow pace of change and the older generation's insistence on moderation. They wanted to confront systemic racism more aggressively. CORE had similar frustrations, but unity was deemed too important just for one day. Meanwhile, the federal government watched with clenched teeth. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had assigned over 100 agents to spy on organizers. They bugged hotel rooms, followed key figures, and compiled dossiers. They were convinced the march would turn violent or that communists would hijack the event. When nothing of the sort happened, they simply doubled down on their surveillance, especially of Dr. King. And let's not forget money. The march cost over $250,000, equivalent to millions today. Most of it was raised through unions and sympathetic donors, but organizers scrambled until the final hour. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington was historic, yes, but it was also deeply human, imperfect, messy, political, and unfinished. Just like the country, it sought to heal. The sun began to dip behind the Washington Monument as the crowd slowly dispersed. People hugged, cried, sang, and lingered as long as they could, reluctant to leave what felt like sacred ground. But the march was over. The speeches had been delivered. The signs had been raised high. The world had watched. And now the question hung heavy in the humid August air. What happens next? In the immediate days that followed, the media reaction was cautiously positive. Major newspapers acknowledged the historic nature of the event, though often with a tone of detached curiosity. Some called it orderly and dignified, which was code for no one rioted. Few outlets gave much space to the specific demands of the march, like the call for a federal jobs program or a $2 minimum wage equivalent to around $20 today. But everyone covered Dr. King's speech. That at least could not be ignored. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the idea of the march, watched it unfold on television with growing admiration and perhaps surprise. He called the event impressive and met with civil rights leaders at the White House immediately afterward, but legislative movement remained slow. His proposed Civil Rights Act was still stalled in Congress, caught in the claws of Southern opposition. Some activists were disappointed. They had hoped the march would result in immediate action. Instead, it was back to the grind, organizing, marching, resisting, and mourning those who paid the price for justice. Just weeks later, that reality hit hard. On September 15, 1963, 4 black girls were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham. The dream had been voiced, yes, but the nightmare wasn't over. Still, something had changed. The March on Washington marked a new phase in the civil rights movement. It proved that mass protest could be disciplined, powerful, and impossible to ignore. It brought together a coalition broader than ever before: labor unions, faith leaders, celebrities, students, and working-class Americans all in one place, united by justice. And most of all, it gave the movement a voice, a dream, a speech that would be quoted, studied, and echoed across the world. The march was over, but the road was just beginning, and that road would soon lead through blood, legislation, and transformation. The March on Washington didn't just rattle the conscience of America, it reshaped its moral landscape. What had begun as an audacious act of protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement's legacy, permanently altering how Americans understood justice, democracy, and the power of collective action. In legislative terms, the march didn't yield immediate victories, but it created momentum. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. It outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed, striking at the very heart of Jim Crow laws. Would these bills have passed without the march? Possibly. But would they have had the same moral force, the same undeniable public pressure? Probably not. For Martin Luther King Jr., the speech that day propelled him into a new realm. He went from respected leader to global icon. But fame came with cost, surveillance, threats, and ultimately assassination in 1968. The dream he spoke of on those steps would become more poignant, more tragic, and more revered with each passing year. For the broader movement, the march showed what unity could achieve. It gave organizers a blueprint for large-scale mobilization, and it inspired a generation of activists both in the US and abroad. Anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and future human rights leaders across the globe would cite the March on Washington as a model. But the legacy isn't just historical, The language of the march, the idea of jobs and freedom, the image of peaceful resistance, the echoes of "I have a dream" still pulses through modern protest. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter rallies, echoes of 1963 reverberate with every chant and every cardboard sign in Washington, D.C. King's Memorial now stands just across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial. Visitors walk past his towering likeness carved in stone with words from that August day etched into the granite. But the real memorial isn't in stone, it's in classrooms, voting booths, marches, and voices refusing to stay silent because the dream wasn't meant to rest in history books, it was meant to be lived. And the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us to do just that. More than 60 years have passed since that summer afternoon when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits. Dr. King's speech is taught in schools. His voice, steady and strong, echoes in national memory like a sacred refrain. But for many, the question remains, has the dream been realized or has it merely been delayed? In some ways, progress is undeniable. The legal framework of segregation was dismantled. Voting rights, though now under fresh assault in many states, were won through blood, marches, and court battles. The presence of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term U.S. president was unthinkable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once illegal in much of the country, is now protected by federal law. These are not small things. They are victories carved out by relentless struggle. And yet the original demands of the march, the ones often overshadowed by King's speech, still echo unresolved. The call for a living wage still unmet. Racial disparities in education, housing, employment, and healthcare remain entrenched. Police brutality, the very thing that sparked much of the early civil rights organizing, continues to ignite outrage and protest. The dream of true economic justice of a country where opportunity is not predetermined by zip code or skin color is still far from reality. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have taken up the mantle, often using the imagery and rhetoric of the 1963 march as both inspiration and indictment. They march through the same cities, chant on the same streets, and demand the same basic human rights, but they do so in a world transformed by social media, surveillance, and new forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never meant to be the conclusion. It was a flashpoint, a stake in the ground that said, "This is who we are and this is what we demand." It was a declaration, not a resolution. So the dream remains battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but still alive. Whether it is deferred, distorted, or one day fulfilled depends not on the past, but on us. On the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the courage we summon to march again and again until the dream becomes a shared, lived reality.